Hey, it's Kley. Welcome to another video. This is going to be a continuation in my 6AU6 Princeton build. I am going to move into a walkthrough explanation of how I built a combo cabinet using pine boards and finger joints. It's a 1x12 combo using obviously a 12-inch speaker, and it is housing what is basically a 5E3 Tweed Deluxe style chassis. But so it would really transfer for any 5E3 style build, have pretty similar dimensions. So I'm really not a woodworker, and I really have never done woodworking on YouTube, so I did not film video of the build process, but I have kept tabs of it with this thread on TDPRI, which I will link below, and I kind of wanted to do a verbal walkthrough explanation of how I created this cabinet. So to start, I bought a pine board. Dimensions were 1x12x72 at my local Ace Hardware, and it was relatively straight, and the dimensions were good. I found some different dimensions like this, for example, of pretty detailed dimensions of a 5E3 Deluxe cabinet. And if you'll notice here, so we've got about 18 by 15, or a 20 by 9.5. So anyways, refer to this diagram for the dimensions. This was kind of what I was going off of when I kind of roughed out my dimensions. You can see here 16 by 20 by 9.5 is 5E3, 16 by 18 by 9 and a little bit over 9 is a Blues Junior. So we're getting some pretty good, the Blues Junior being slightly smaller, the 5E3 being slightly wider. So I started with this board. Then I used my the straight edge and some clamps and a circular saw to cross-cut these pieces into more manageable, keeping them a bit lengthy, a bit beyond those initial dimensions, just to help give me some room as I bring them down. Now you'll notice that these boards had a little bit of cup to them, so I actually solved that by planing these bad boys down in my planer. So that went pretty nicely. Next, I was attempting to put together different box joints, and there's a whole lot of different ways to do box joints, and there's a lot of discussion here on how I did it, but ultimately, I found out that doing it on the router was my best choice. So you can see here's my router table. There's the router bit, and I just have a half-inch straight bit, and then I created this fence, which would ride along the outside edges of the table to keep it straight and to provide a vertical fence by which I could build this jig. And there's this video right here, which I will link down in the description, which provides better information and explanation on how to use the jig. But basically you set the bit height to the thickness of the wood. That is going to determine how deep the fingers are cut. Then I made some test cuts, so get a nice clean cut there. I was really happy with that. Then I built this spacer, so I cut it out with the handsaw, and then I actually used my belt sander here to get the spacer down to a very exact fit so that it would fit in that wedge very perfectly. And the size of this spacer really needs to be exactly the same size as the router bit making the cut. So that was pretty crucial. Then the next thing that I did is mess with the spacing of the bit of this backing board left and right relative to the router bit, and that determines the size of the fingers. And so I was using this stop block here to help me position this backer board and how it is connected onto that sled. Here you can see some of my test cuts. And then I was having some problems with tear out. And so what I decided to do, you can see this is that little wedge that I cut out, that spacer. And then this distance here is determined again by the positioning of the backing board relative to the sled. And then I filled in this space so that I could have a nice firm back as it slides through the bit to help. The backer board helps with tear out. So you can see here how the jig is all positioned. Again, this spacer is the exact same size as this bit. Then the distance between the spacer and the edge of the bit should also, again, be that same dimension, half-inch, and that is, again, determined by the positioning of this backing board against the sled. And then you basically just clamp the piece on, run it through, move it over on the notch, run it through, and away you go. So then you get multiple of these test cuts. Now here you can see I'm getting a lot of tear out. So the way that I managed to help with that was by doing a front backing board. And you can see this looks pretty good. So, basically you can see this, if this is my large board here that's actually getting the cut, then this little piece is my front backing board. So basically the board that I actually want to use is completely sandwiched with sacrificial pieces. And then this is how my finger joints came out. Nice and tight, looking good. And this is the first test fitting of the box. I was pretty pleased with how that all came together. And then I was gluing and clamping everything up. Now I also chose to add some of these cleats in the corner. And these really are not necessary, but it was just kind of my own over-engineering. And if you don't want to do finger joints, you can use these cleats. That's totally fine, and just put these pieces together. But I chose to install these, I glued, I think I just glued them actually. And then I also added these cleats, which are necessary for the front and back panels that run along the sides. Just use a piece of 2x4. Then this is my front baffle. I used a 3/4 inch piece of plywood. Now, I think like a 1/2 inch would maybe be a little bit more optimal. The front baffle is what the speaker is housed upon, and there are some different theories here, but one of the theories is with more of a vintage amp, they use thinner baffle material, and that really allows the front baffle to resonate with the movement of the speaker. A speaker is pushing and pulling with these audio waves, and so if you have a baffle that is thinner material, like a 1/2 inch, it can resonate almost like an acoustic guitar top and contribute a lot to the sound. Now a 3/4 inch piece of lumber like this is going to be a little bit stiffer, a little bit more modern perhaps, and I just really used it because I had it on hand, but certainly your own preferences can come into play here. Next I drew a circle, or I found the center of this piece so that I could draw a circle by if you take a straight edge and go from corner to corner and draw a line, then another for the opposite corner and corner, draw a line. Where those two lines intersect is necessarily the center of the board. And then I just drew some other lines to help guide from there. Then I stuck a drill bit in there and used my tri-square and a pencil to draw this circle. Now, this is the inner diameter of the circle, which I measured out, and then the outer diameter is just about a 1/2 inch bigger than that. I'm going to be rear mounting the speaker, so I want to just cut along the inside. Then I used my jigsaw to cut that circle out, and I did so using this jig. And actually, so I've got everything up so that the blade doesn't cut into my workbench, and then screwed this board down into that center point. And then I just, put this board, and the jigsaw is kind of pushing up against it, so it gives it a consistent edge as it spins around that center point. And there you can see is my completed circle. Now this will be covered up, so it's not 100% crucial that it is perfect, but that's where I got that circle from. Now I took some satin black paint and painted the speaker baffle so you don't see through the grill cloth. Next I cut out, this is going to be the control cavity for the chassis, just using my handsaw and then the hammer really, and then the if I'm making multiple vertical cuts, then you can hit them out with the hammer pretty easily. Then I use the chisel to clean it up. Next, I moved on to the covering the baffle with a grill cloth. This is some burlap material with a pattern that I got at my local craft shop that I kind of liked. I chose the burlap because I thought it looked cool and it was pretty, porous, meaning a lot of air can go through it, so the airwaves can travel freely. I cut it out roughly to size, and then basically I just started pulling it up so that it was kind of at a consistent, so that my lines are kind of consistent, and then I used this heavy-duty staple gun to staple it on. And the key here is that you really want to try and pull it very, very tight so that it's not kind of droopy. You want it to be very taut. And one of the things that I would offer as a tip that I read is to use a hairdryer to soften it before you move it. And then once it cools, it will be even tighter. So this was my final result. It's not perfect. You can see it's slightly wavy, which I did a little bit of fixing on later, but I was pretty pleased with the result overall. And I think it looks pretty nice. I like the pattern. This was kind of the first version of the back panel. We'll see that later. Here what I'm doing is I'm using this piece of plywood as a backer, and then I use my router with a bearing on it to guide along the backer to make this cutout here really, really flush and clean. Next, I used a roundover bit. I used a 3/8 inch roundover to go over the entire edge of the combo, and this really made it start to look like a guitar cabinet, in my opinion. Really nice look, and you can see a close-up there of the finger joints after they get rounded over. It looks really neat. Then I mounted the chassis in place with these 2 screws here on the side, and the screws actually screw into the chassis itself, so that was a cool feature there. Then I decided to modify my back panel, and I have these boards here from a pallet that I salvaged, ran them through my planer. This is what they start off as, really rough, and I run them through the planer a bunch to get them clean and square, and it produces a lot of shavings. Then I actually noticed that the way that here we go, you can see there's a tiny little gap here from the cleat to the chassis. So I actually compensated for that by using my router to remove a little bit and cut out a kind of a dado or something, or I don't exactly know what it would be, a rabbit maybe, so that it can fit in a little bit deeper. And there you can see it sits nice and tight up against the edge of the chassis there. And a front and lower back panel. And there's a speaker. I've actually using a different speaker, but that is it installed. I just screwed the baffle into those cleats, screwed in the rear panel, and here we go. Since this time, I have got this Jensen. It's a P12R speaker, which I'm experimenting with. It had a little bit of a cone repair, but I was okay with that. I got it for a good price. Then this was my handle idea. I actually bought this as a tarp strap, so kind of a piece of rubber. And then I used these screws and washers and nuts to hold it in place. So we'll see how that goes. And that's where I'm at currently. So I've got a speaker combo cab, and I will do some follow-up videos on how the amp sounds in its new combo cab. So if you have any questions, refer to this thread and perhaps ask the really smart gentleman here. You certainly may ask me questions, but I am not a master woodworker, and got a lot of help in this thread, so check that out. So anyways, let me know your thoughts and comments, or if you have any tips for my next build, leave them down below. If not, thanks for checking it out. I'll see you soon. Bye.